As Mark Carney arrives in China in an effort to reset relations between our two countries, two Liberal MPs visiting Taiwan are cutting short their trip. Let's start there with Johnathan Berkshire Miller, co-founder and principal at Pendulum Geopolitical Advisory. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me on.
So I guess Ottawa doesn't want to ruffle feathers in China, which is why the MPs left Taiwan. Could this have affected trade talks?
Well, look, I mean, I think China wants to make sure that it controls all narratives of this trip. And I think this is an example of Canada being overly cautious. There's normal parliamentary engagement with Taiwan, which we recognize as a strong economic partner. We have a trade office in Taipei. There's nothing unusual about parliamentarians, whether they're from the ruling party, which is now the Liberals, or the opposition visiting Taiwan. Obviously, the timing may be inconvenient for the Prime Minister's office at this point in time, but I worry what this might signal to the Chinese is that, look, without even asking, and we don't know that there was a formal ask from the Chinese side, we're willing to pull back things that have been normal practice for Canada in the hopes that we may curry favor and maybe get some deals in China. So I think it was a bit of a difficult decision that was made.
Okay, so the wider question is, how does Ottawa go about trying to increase trade without compromising what the country stands for?
So I support the trip generally. Look, China is the second biggest economy in the world. It's the largest economy in the Indo-Pacific. It's a relationship that's been under heavy strain, of course, over the past few years, much of that the doing of the Chinese Communist Party with the detention of our citizens, et cetera. But I do support the Prime Minister in engaging with the Chinese. Of course, we see the economic pressure that we're facing with the United States. But I think there's a couple simple correctives that we need to have put in place. First of all, diversification is not equal amongst all different parties. So we have, of course, our countries in Europe, Japan and Korea, which are like-minded democracies, which it makes sense to engage with. And then we have complicated countries like India, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates that we've been engaging with. China is a different beast. Not only is its economic size different, but also its political intentions, the nature of its system, make it a bit more complex. So it's not that we shouldn't be engaging with them on trade issues. This is important to our farmers. This is important to our energy industry. But I think we have to do it with our eyes wide open and realize the risks of vulnerabilities going forward.
Okay, so what are the vulnerabilities that you see?
Well, we see, I mean, this goes to the idea that when you have politics and economics and trade, we might like to see them as sometimes separate and that we can isolate them as much as possible. Business can do business, and the security issues can be managed by governments and diplomats and defense ministries. Unfortunately, China doesn't see the world this way. So we've seen this time and time again. When something politically is not in the interest of China, they're willing to leverage and weaponize those economic sectors. So we've seen it in the canola industry. We've seen it in the pork industry. We've seen it in the seafood industry. So I think it's being very open. You know, it's great if we sign more natural gas deals, for example, which might happen during this trip. But what happens 2 or 3 years down the road if all of a sudden there's a political irritant in that relationship and China decides to weaponize that again? So I think it's just being open about where those vulnerabilities could be and how we could manage that risk.
Arctic security, of course, is something that will likely come up in this discussion. Can China be trusted in security cooperation with Canada?
Well, look, I think China is a country that we manage risk on when it comes to security. I wouldn't see cooperation, traditional cooperation in the lens that we work with our traditional allies and friends. I do think it's a discussion that we have to have with China. Not only is it a national security issue with the examples of political interference in our domestic politics, but it's also a regional security issue. While Mark Carney is now in China for 4 days, we're only a couple weeks away from where China's held its largest and most diversified scope of military exercises around Taiwan. We continue to see the harassment of countries in Southeast Asia like the Philippines and Vietnam and the South China Sea. And one of our key allies in the Indo-Pacific, Japan, which is facing economic coercion right now vis-a-vis China. So I think it's, look, security cooperation and discussion is important, but I think it's more about managing risks than necessarily being a partner.
Okay. How do you think this visit by our Prime Minister to Beijing will be perceived by the U.S.?
Well, first of all, I wonder how much they're paying attention. Certain folks are paying attention, but I do think generally they will be watching. I think they'll be watching on a couple of different lanes. One of them will be on the economic and trade side. Of course, one of the biggest priorities for Mark Carney going forward is to try to remedy and find a way out on trade issues with the United States. And CUSMA negotiations, the trade negotiations, will be one of the big areas. If there are significant reductions, for example, on tariffs on electric vehicles, which is something the Chinese very much want. There's currently 100% tariff on Chinese EVs coming to Canada. I think that will be looked upon in a negative light from Washington and may affect our own trade negotiations. The second area, I think, will be more broadly about Canada becoming a less reliable ally in the region. And I think Washington is watching this, but it's not just Washington. I think others in the region are looking. For example, Foreign Minister Anand mentioned today, when asked about the Indo-Pacific strategy, which was a former strategy for the region, she said, well, it's a new prime minister and a new government and times are changing. Effectively saying that what was policy before is no longer policy now, which I think will be met with a little bit of alarm in the region and potentially by the U.S. too.
Yeah, I think people are pivoting according to how the U.S. is pivoting, and that might be sort of part of the explanation that comes from Ottawa. But Johnathan Berkshire Miller, I got to leave it there. So thanks for your time. Appreciate it.